Welcome to Slumbertainment. Get comfortable, close your eyes, and let yourself relax. Tonight we explore the history of armour. Please like and subscribe for more restful content. Now, let's begin. The story of armour begins not with metal, but with the fundamental human impulse to survive. Long before civilizations rose and fell, before the first copper was smelted or the first bronze cast, early humans recognized a simple truth that would echo through millennia. The body is vulnerable, and vulnerability invites harm. The earliest forms of protection were born from observation of the natural world, where thick hides shielded animals from claw and tooth, where layered materials absorbed impact in ways that single surfaces could not. In the distant past, perhaps 40,000 years ago or more, humans began wrapping themselves in the skins of large animals. These were not merely garments against cold, but deliberate choices of protection. The hide of an aurochs or a bear, when properly prepared, offered remarkable resistance to the slashing attacks that characterized early warfare and hunting accidents. Leather, when layered and allowed to dry in specific ways, becomes remarkably tough. The collagen fibers within animal skin are arranged in a complex weave, and when multiple layers are compressed together, they create a matrix that can catch and slow a sharpened edge or a pointed tip. This is the first principle of armour, that resistance comes not always from hardness, but from the ability to distribute and absorb force across a wider area. The progression from simple hides to more sophisticated organic armour took thousands of years, but it followed logical paths determined by available materials and observed needs. In regions where large animals were scarce but plant fibers abundant, communities discovered that thick padding of linen or hemp, quilted into multiple layers, could achieve similar protective effects. The quilted textile armour that would later be called a gambeson in medieval Europe had ancient predecessors in many cultures. The principle was sound. Dozens of layers of cloth, stitched together in patterns that prevented shifting, created a cushion that could absorb the energy of a blow. When struck, the individual fibers would stretch and compress, converting the kinetic energy of impact into heat and deformation rather than allowing it to pass through to flesh and bone. Some of the earliest archaeological evidence of purposeful armour construction comes from reed and wood. In marshy regions, reeds could be bundled and bound into protective vests. The hollow structure of reed creates countless air pockets, and when bundled tightly together, these create a surprisingly effective barrier against both cutting and piercing. Wood, too, found its place in early protection. Thin strips of hardwood, overlapped and bound with sinew or plant fibre, created flexible scales that could move with the body while still offering resistance to weapons. This scaling principle would prove to be one of the most enduring concepts in armour design, recurring across continents and centuries in various forms. The innovation of cord and leatherworking allowed for another critical development: the ability to space protective elements away from the body. A solid piece of material worn directly against the skin transmits impact force directly to the wearer. But when that same material is held slightly away, suspended by straps or padding, it can deform upon impact without that deformation immediately affecting the body beneath. This spacing creates what later engineers would call standoff distance, and it transforms how protective equipment functions. Early armourers, working purely through trial and observation, discovered this principle through incremental refinement. Bone and horn entered the picture as humans began processing the remains of their hunts with greater sophistication. Bone, particularly the long bones of large mammals, could be split and shaped into plates that were both lightweight and remarkably strong. The compact bone tissue that forms the outer layer of skeletal elements has a complex microscopic structure, with collagen fibers and mineral crystals arranged in overlapping patterns. This composite structure makes bone resistant to both bending and fracturing, at least up to certain force thresholds. Small bone plates, drilled and sewn onto leather backing, created armour that was more rigid than hide alone, but still flexible enough for movement. Horn, with its laminated structure of keratin, offered similar properties and could be boiled and moulded into curved shapes that followed body contours. The arrangement of these early armour elements reveals sophisticated understanding of anatomy and vulnerability. Protection concentrated on the torso, where vital organs resided. The head, being both critical and relatively small, received special attention. Simple caps of thick leather, sometimes reinforced with bone or wood splints, represented early helmets. These were not designed to prevent all injury, but to convert potentially fatal blows into survivable ones, to deflect rather than resist absolutely. The principle of deflection would become increasingly important as armour evolved. A glancing surface that redirects force is often more effective than a flat surface that must absorb it entirely. Limb protection presented different challenges. Arms and legs must move through wide ranges of motion, and any armour that restricted this movement too severely became a liability rather than an asset. Early solutions favoured protecting the outer surfaces of limbs, particularly the forearms and shins, which were most likely to be struck in combat. These protections often took the form of splints, rigid elements bound to the limb with leather straps, positioned to shield bone that lay close to the skin. The inner surfaces of arms and legs, being more mobile and less frequently struck, received less coverage. This selective protection reflected a pragmatic understanding. Absolute invulnerability was impossible, so armour focused on reducing the most likely and most dangerous injuries. The weight of protection has always been a concern. A human can carry only so much mass before fatigue becomes dangerous, before reaction time slows and movement becomes laboured. Early armourers learned through necessity to distribute weight across the strongest parts of the body. Shoulder straps and waist belts transferred loads to the skeletal frame rather than letting them hang from neck or arms. The physics of weight distribution would remain a central challenge throughout the entire history of armour. Every addition of protective material must be justified by the threat it counters, weighed against the burden it places on the wearer. By the time the first cities were forming in Mesopotamia and the Nile Valley, around 5,000 years ago, armour had already undergone thousands of years of development. The basic vocabulary of protection had been established through slow, pragmatic evolution. Layering, scaling, spacing, selective coverage, and weight distribution were all understood principles, even if they were not expressed in such terms. The stage was set for the next revolution, one that would come not from new ideas about protection, but from new materials that could embody those ideas with unprecedented effectiveness. Metal was beginning to transform human civilization, and armour would be among its most enduring applications. The discovery of metalworking, beginning with copper around 7,000 years ago, opened possibilities that organic materials could never provide. Copper, soft and malleable in its pure form, could be hammered into thin sheets that conform to complex curves. Early metalsmiths in the Fertile Crescent and the Balkans learned to work these sheets into simple protective pieces, though pure copper presented limitations. It was too soft to hold an edge well and could be deformed by relatively modest impacts. Yet even in this primitive form, copper armour offered advantages. It did not rot like leather, did not splinter like wood, and its very novelty carried psychological weight in conflicts where most combatants had never seen such material. The transformative moment came with bronze, an alloy of copper and tin that emerged around 3000 BCE. The addition of tin, typically in proportions of around 10%, fundamentally altered copper's properties. Bronze is significantly harder than pure copper, able to take and hold a sharp edge while remaining workable under heat and hammer. The metallurgical principle at work involves the tin atoms disrupting the orderly crystal structure of copper, making it more difficult for the metal to deform. This solid solution strengthening, as modern materials science terms it, created a material that could be both shaped by skilled craftsmen and resistant to the forces encountered in battle. Bronze armour first appeared in the great civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. The Sumerians, Akkadians and Egyptians began fashioning bronze into scales, small rectangular or rounded pieces that could be attached to fabric or leather backing in overlapping rows. Scale armour represented a sophisticated solution to the competing demands of protection and mobility. Each scale could overlap its neighbours, allowing the entire assembly to flex and bend while still presenting a continuous metallic surface. When struck, individual scales could deform or even break away without compromising the integrity of the entire garment. The principle was similar to the reptilian scales that may have inspired the design, many small elements working together to create flexible protection. The Bronze Age also saw the development of solid bronze chest plates, particularly among the wealthier warrior classes who could afford such substantial expenditures of precious metal. The famous Dendra panoply, discovered in Greece and dating to around 1500 BCE, consists of multiple bronze plates that together encase the torso, shoulders, and neck. This armour reveals sophisticated understanding of compound curves and articulation. The chest pieces are shaped to follow the body's contours, hammered into forms that both deflect blows and distribute their force across a wide area. Where movement is necessary, at the shoulders and waist, the plates are designed to overlap and slide against one another, maintaining protection while allowing the wearer to move arms and bend at the torso. Creating such armour required mastery of multiple techniques. Bronze sheets were first cast or hammered into rough blanks, then repeatedly heated and worked to achieve the desired thickness and shape. This process, called work hardening, actually increases the metal's strength with each cycle of deformation and annealing. The bronze becomes denser, its internal structure more resistant to further deformation. Skilled armourers learned to read the metal's colour as it was heated, knowing precisely when it had reached the temperature for effective working without becoming brittle. The edges of plates were often rolled or thickened, creating reinforced borders that resisted cracking and provided attachment points for straps or additional elements. Bronze helmets evolved alongside body armour, moving from simple caps to elaborate constructions that protected the entire head while allowing vision and hearing. The Corinthian helmet, perhaps the most iconic of ancient designs, emerged in Greece around 700 BCE. Cast and hammered from a single piece of bronze, it covered the entire head except for openings at the eyes and mouth. The cheek pieces curved inward, protecting the face while the nasal guard descended from the brow. This design created what modern engineers would call a crumple zone. The extended cheek and nasal pieces would deform under impact, absorbing energy before it could reach the skull. The helmet's rounded dome shape was equally important, presenting no flat surfaces for weapons to strike squarely. Everything was designed to glance or deflect. In Asia, bronze armour followed different aesthetic and functional paths while employing similar metallurgical principles. Chinese bronze workers, benefiting from sophisticated casting techniques, created elaborate scale and lamella armours. Lamella construction differed from scale in a subtle but important way. Instead of being attached to a backing, lamella plates were laced directly to one another in horizontal rows. This created a more rigid structure that stood somewhat away from the body, providing that critical standoff distance. Chinese armourers also developed bronze helmets with distinctive shapes, often featuring wide brims or peaks that would deflect downward strikes away from the head and shoulders. The weight of bronze armour was considerable. A full panoply of bronze could easily exceed 20 kilograms, and in the heat of the Mediterranean or Near Eastern sun, wearing such protection was an ordeal. Only well-trained warriors, often those with sufficient wealth to spend years in martial training rather than agricultural labour, could fight effectively under such burdens. This created tactical realities. Heavily armoured infantry moved in tight formations where mutual support compensated for individual mobility. The famous Greek phalanx, with its overlapping shields and massed spears, was as much a consequence of armour's limitations as of tactical innovation. Men encased in bronze could not fight as skirmishers or pursue fleeing enemies with much effectiveness, so they developed fighting methods that emphasised cohesion and the grinding pressure of sustained close combat. Bronze armour also established patterns of social distinction that would persist throughout history. The expense of metal, the specialised labour required for its creation, and the training needed to fight while wearing it all combined to make such armour a marker of elite status. In many ancient armies, only the front ranks or the officer class wore substantial metal protection, while common soldiers made do with leather, linen, or quilted fabrics. This inequality of protection reflected economic realities and created tactical hierarchies that shaped how battles were fought and who survived them. Yet bronze had limitations that would eventually drive its replacement. The metal is relatively soft compared to what would come later, and tin was often scarce, making bronze expensive to produce. A bronze edge could be bent or notched by sustained combat, and a bronze plate could be penetrated by determined strikes from hardened weapons. The very alloy that had revolutionized protection and warfare for over 2,000 years was about to be superseded by a material more abundant, stronger, and ultimately more transformative, iron, and its refined form, steel. Iron appeared in human hands around 1200 BCE, though its use spread slowly across different regions over several centuries. Unlike copper and tin, iron ore was abundant, found in deposits throughout Europe, Asia, and Africa. Yet iron presented challenges that bronze did not. Iron melts at a much higher temperature than bronze, beyond the reach of most early furnaces. Instead of casting, early ironworking relied on a process called bloomery smelting, where iron ore was heated with charcoal in a clay furnace. The result was not liquid metal, but a spongy mass called a bloom, a mixture of metallic iron and slag that had to be repeatedly heated and hammered to drive out impurities and consolidate the metal into usable bars. This laborious process produced wrought iron, relatively soft and not significantly superior to bronze in its basic form. What transformed iron from a curiosity into the dominant material of warfare was the discovery of carburization, the addition of carbon to iron's crystalline structure. When iron is heated in contact with charcoal and held at high temperature, carbon atoms migrate into the surface layers of the metal. This carbon, even in small amounts of less than 1%, dramatically increases hardness and strength. The resulting material is steel, though ancient smiths did not understand the chemistry underlying their craft. They knew only that iron treated in certain ways became harder, could hold a keener edge, and resisted deformation better than bronze ever could. The transition from bronze to iron armour was neither uniform nor immediate. For centuries, the two materials coexisted, with bronze often preferred for armour, even as iron became common for weapons. Bronze was easier to work into large smooth plates and did not rust as iron did. But as ironworking techniques improved and smiths learned to produce larger pieces of consistent quality, iron's advantages became undeniable. A well-made iron plate was stronger than bronze of the same thickness, meaning armour could be equally protective while weighing less, or could offer superior protection at the same weight. For armies equipping thousands of soldiers, the abundance of iron ore made it economically practical to provide metal armour to a broader segment of fighting forces. Mail emerged as perhaps the most significant innovation of the Iron Age, a form of armour that would remain in use for well over 1,000 years. Mail, sometimes called chainmail, though this term is redundant, consists of thousands of small metal rings linked together in a pattern where each ring passes through 4 others. The origins of mail are obscure, but it appears to have developed somewhere in Central Asia or the Celtic lands of Europe around the 4th or 3rd century BCE. Creating mail was extraordinarily labour-intensive. Each ring had to be formed from wire, cut to length, bent around a mandrel, and then linked into the growing fabric of the garment. Some mail used solid rings punched from sheet metal, while higher quality mail alternated solid rings with riveted rings, where the ends were flattened, overlapped, and secured with a tiny rivet. This riveted construction prevented rings from opening under stress. The protective principle of mail differs fundamentally from solid plate. Mail does not prevent a weapon from touching the wearer. Instead, it distributes the force of impact across many rings. When a blade strikes mail, the point or edge contacts several rings simultaneously. These rings transfer force to their neighbours, which transfer it to theirs, spreading what would have been a concentrated cutting or piercing force across a much larger area. Against slashing cuts, mail is remarkably effective. The blade cannot pass between rings that are properly sized and closed, and the distributed force rarely has sufficient pressure at any single point to cut through the metal itself. Against piercing weapons like arrows or narrow spear points, mail is less reliable. A forceful thrust can sometimes spread rings apart or even break them, allowing the weapon point to penetrate. This is why mail was almost always worn over padding, typically a quilted gambeson, which absorbed impact energy and provided a final barrier if the mail itself was compromised. The flexibility of mail was both advantage and limitation. A mail shirt moved with the wearer, imposing minimal restriction on the range of motion. A warrior in mail could run, climb and fight with nearly the freedom of an unarmoured man, though carrying an additional 10 to 15 kilograms. However, this same flexibility meant mail provided no resistance to blunt trauma. A heavy blow from a mace or hammer would not penetrate the mail, but would transfer its full force through the interlocking rings directly to the body beneath. Broken bones and internal injuries could occur even when the mail itself remained intact. The padding worn underneath helped, but could not fully compensate for mail's inability to distribute blunt force the way rigid plate could. Roman armour of the classical period demonstrated sophisticated integration of different protective principles. The lorica segmentata, used by legionaries from approximately the 1st through 3rd centuries CE, combined the flexibility of articulated construction with the rigidity of plate. This armour consisted of iron strips arranged in horizontal hoops around the torso, with the hoops connected by leather straps that allowed them to expand and contract with breathing and movement. The shoulders were protected by curved plates that overlapped and slid against one another. The entire assembly could be donned quickly by loosening the straps, wrapping it around the body, and tightening everything into place. This armour provided excellent protection against both cuts and thrusts, while distributing weight effectively across the shoulders and waist. Its construction reflected Roman military logistics. The segmented design made repairs easier, as damaged sections could be replaced without discarding the entire piece, and the relatively standardized components could be manufactured in quantity. Roman auxiliary troops and earlier legionaries often wore mail, called lorica hamata. which the Romans likely adopted from Celtic peoples. Some Romans also used scale armour, larica squamata, particularly in eastern provinces. This diversity of armour types within a single military system reflected practical adaptation to different threats, economic considerations, and the varying origins of the soldiers themselves. Rome's genius lay not in inventing new forms of protection, but in systematizing production and distribution so that effective armour could be provided to professional soldiers as standard equipment rather than personal property. In other parts of the world, iron and steel were transforming armour along parallel paths. Persian cavalry wore coats of small iron scales or mail, protection that allowed them to fight as horse archers and shock cavalry. In India, mail and scale armours appeared alongside continued use of quilted cotton protection, which remained effective and practical in tropical climates where metal could become unbearably hot. Chinese armourers continued their tradition of lamellar construction, now using iron rather than bronze, creating flexible yet protective coats that would influence armour design throughout East Asia. The material had changed, but the fundamental challenge remained constant: how to protect the human body without rendering it immobile or exhausted. The medieval period in Europe, stretching roughly from the 5th through the 15th centuries, witnessed gradual but profound evolution in armour design. This era began with the collapse of Roman centralised production, and initially saw a regression in armour availability and sophistication. Early medieval warriors often wore only mail shirts that reached to mid-thigh, called hauberks, over padded undergarments. Helmets were simple conical or rounded forms, functional but lacking the refinement of earlier Roman designs. Yet within this apparent simplicity, smiths were developing techniques that would eventually produce the most sophisticated personal armour in human history. The crucible of medieval armour development was the mounted warrior, the knight, whose tactical role demanded protection that could withstand lance impacts and sword strikes while allowing sufficient mobility to fight from horseback. Mail remained the dominant protection through the 11th and 12th centuries, but its limitations against heavy blows became increasingly apparent. The solution emerged gradually: the addition of rigid plate elements over mail, beginning with the most vulnerable areas. Knee guards called pollenes appeared in the 13th century, simple dished plates that covered the kneecap and were strapped over the mail hose. Elbow guards, or couters, followed similar principles. These early plate additions represented a hybrid approach, combining mail's flexibility with plate's superior resistance to crushing impacts. The 14th century saw accelerating development of plate armour, driven partly by improvements in metallurgy and partly by changes in battlefield threats. Crossbows and increasingly powerful longbows could penetrate mail under certain conditions, creating demand for better protection. Smiths learned to produce larger plates of consistent quality, and more importantly, they mastered the art of shaping these plates into compound curves that fit the body while deflecting blows effectively. A flat plate, when struck, must absorb the full force of impact. A curved plate presents a glancing surface that redirects force, requiring far less metal thickness to achieve the same protective effect. This principle of deflective geometry became central to late medieval armour design. The breastplate evolved from a simple curved shell into a sophisticated piece of engineering. By the late 14th century, breastplates featured a central ridge or keel running vertically down the sternum. This ridge served multiple purposes. It stiffened the plate against inward deformation, provided a natural deflecting surface that guided weapon points to either side, and added minimal weight while significantly improving structural integrity. The globose breastplates of the 15th century took this further, with smooth, rounded surfaces that presented no flat areas for weapons to strike perpendicularly. These forms were not arbitrary aesthetic choices, but carefully reasoned solutions to mechanical problems. Articulation became increasingly sophisticated as plate armor expanded to cover more of the body. The problem was straightforward. A rigid shell that cannot move with the body is useless in combat. Medieval armorers solved this through systems of overlapping plates connected by internal levers, sliding rivets, and carefully designed edges that could rotate against one another. The gauntlet, protecting the hand, exemplified this complexity. The fingers had to bend, the wrist had to rotate, yet all needed continuous protection. Armorers created articulated fingers from multiple small plates, each slightly overlapping the next, all mounted on leather strips that flexed with the hand's movement. The palm might be protected by mail or by carefully shaped plates that did not interfere with gripping a weapon. Every joint in the body presented unique challenges, and medieval armorers developed specific solutions for each. The complete suit of plate armor, or harness as it was often called, represented the culmination of centuries of incremental improvement. By the mid-15th century, a wealthy knight could be encased almost entirely in steel plates, with mail filling only the smallest gaps at joints. Such armor typically weighed between 20 and 30 kilograms, distributed across the entire body through careful design. The weight was supported primarily by the hips and shoulders, using the skeletal frame to carry the load rather than hanging it from any single point. A well-fitted harness allowed surprising mobility. Modern experiments have shown that trained individuals can run, jump, climb, and even perform gymnastic movements while wearing full plate. The restriction was not primarily in movement, but in endurance. Carrying such weight inevitably caused fatigue more quickly than fighting unarmored. The quality of armor varied enormously based on the skill of the armorer and the wealth of the client. Master armorers in centers like Milan, Augsburg, and Greenwich produced bespoke pieces tailored precisely to individual measurements, with sophisticated articulation and elegant proportions. These were not merely functional objects but works of art, often decorated with etching, gilding, or embossing. Lesser armor, produced more quickly and in more standardized sizes, still provided effective protection but lacked the refined fit and finish of masterworks. The cheapest armor, sometimes called munitions grade, was manufactured in quantity for common soldiers, using simpler construction and cruder finishing. The effectiveness of plate armor was never merely a matter of material. It depended equally on the precision of manufacture and the accuracy of fit. In other parts of the world, different solutions emerged from different tactical requirements and available technologies. Japanese armor, developing largely independently, favored flexibility over absolute protection. The characteristic samurai armor, or yoroi, used small iron or leather scales called kozan, laced together with silk or leather cord in complex patterns. This construction created a flexible yet protective garment that could withstand arrows and sword cuts while allowing the weeping movements required by Japanese martial techniques. The lacing patterns were not merely decorative. Different configurations created different degrees of flexibility and protection, adapted to the role of the wearer. Japanese armorers also developed sophisticated iron plate elements for critical areas like the chest and shoulders, but the overall philosophy emphasized mobility and endurance over maximum protection. Islamic armorers in the Middle East and Central Asia continued traditions of mail and scale, often combining these with plate elements in ways that reflected the region's emphasis on cavalry warfare. The need to fight in intense heat influenced design choices, favoring construction that allowed air circulation and using lighter weight elements where possible. Persian and Ottoman armourers created beautiful and effective armours that integrated mail shirts with plate braces, articulated arm defences, and helmets featuring mail aventails that protected the neck and shoulders. These armours were designed for warriors who fought primarily from horseback, using bows, lances, and curved sabres in fluid, mobile combat, rather than the heavy shock charges characteristic of European knights. By the end of the 15th century, the armour had reached a level of sophistication that would never be exceeded in purely physical protection. Yet change was already coming, driven by technological developments that would ultimately render even the finest plate armour obsolete. Gunpowder weapons were spreading across Europe and Asia, and the challenge they presented could not be solved simply by making armour thicker or more cleverly shaped. The arrival of gunpowder weapons in Europe during the 14th century initiated a transformation that would fundamentally alter the relationship between protection and warfare. Early firearms were crude and unreliable, often more dangerous to their operators than to their targets, but they introduced a threat that traditional armour had never been designed to counter. A crossbow bolt or arrow delivered its energy through a small point, relying on penetration to cause injury. A bullet, even a relatively slow-moving one from an early matchlock or arquebus, carried far more kinetic energy and delivered it over a slightly larger area. The blunt trauma of bullet impact, combined with its ability to deform and punch through materials that would stop edged weapons, presented challenges that could not be solved through deflective geometry alone. Initial responses to firearms involved making armour thicker, particularly on the breastplate where a frontal shot was most likely. By the early 16th century, many breastplates were being proofed, meaning they were tested by firing a gun at them from a specified distance. If the plate stopped the bullet, often leaving a visible dent, it was considered proof against that weapon, and might even have the dent left as a mark of quality. Proofed armour was substantially heavier than earlier designs, with breastplates sometimes reaching 4 or 5 millimeters in thickness, more than double the thickness of late medieval plate. This additional weight concentrated on the torso, as attempting to make an entire suit proof against firearms would have resulted in something too heavy for any human to wear effectively. The result was a gradual simplification and reduction of armour coverage. By the mid-16th century, many cavalry soldiers wore only three-quarter armour, protecting the body and arms, but leaving the legs below the knee undefended. Others adopted half armour, covering only the torso and sometimes the arms. This reduction was pragmatic. If complete encasement in plate was no longer practical due to weight, better to focus protection on vital areas and accept some vulnerability elsewhere. The cuirass, consisting of breastplate and backplate, became the core element of military armour, supplemented by helmets and sometimes arm defences. Leg armour largely disappeared from military use, as the weight savings were more valuable than the protection provided. Helmet design evolved in response to firearms as well. The enclosed helms of the medieval period, offering maximum protection but limited visibility and ventilation, gave way to more open designs. The morion, with its distinctive high crest and wide brim, became common among infantry. The burgonet, with its peak and hinged cheek pieces, was favoured by cavalry. These helmets offered reasonable protection against sword cuts and glancing blows while allowing better sight and hearing. They were generally not proof against direct gunfire, representing an acceptance that absolute protection was no longer achievable at reasonable weight. The 17th century saw continued refinement of what would become standard military armour for the next 2 centuries: the cuirass and helmet. Pike and musket formations dominated European battlefields, and the infantry who operated in these formations increasingly wore standardized munitions armour produced in quantity. These cuirasses were functional rather than elegant, made of iron or low-grade steel, often left with rough finishes. They were designed to be worn over thick buff coats, leather garments that provided padding and additional protection. The combination of leather coat and iron cuirass offered reasonable defense against sword cuts and spent musket balls while remaining affordable enough to equip large armies. Heavy cavalry, particularly cuirassiers, wore heavier versions and sometimes retained closed helmets, accepting restricted vision in exchange for better protection during charges. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, responses to firearms followed different trajectories based on local circumstances. In Japan, where firearms arrived via Portuguese traders in the mid-16th century, armourers began incorporating iron plates specifically designed to resist bullets. These tameshi gusoku, or bullet-tested armours, featured solid iron breastplates that were deliberately shot during manufacture to verify their resistance. However, Japanese warfare remained more focused on traditional weapons longer than in Europe, and full armour continued to be manufactured and worn well into the 19th century, long after it had largely disappeared from Western battlefields. The Mughal Empire and other Indian states adopted firearms enthusiastically, but heavy armour remained less common due to climate. Indian armourers instead focused on mail and brigandine, a form of armour where small steel plates were riveted between layers of fabric or leather. Brigandine offered reasonable protection while being lighter and cooler than solid plate. The plates, invisible from the outside, could be made thick enough to resist some firearms, while the overall garment remained more comfortable in heat. This design philosophy, prioritizing wearability over maximum protection, reflected practical wisdom about the limited value of armour that was too uncomfortable to actually wear in campaign conditions. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, armour was in decline across most of Europe. Infantry had largely abandoned it, except for some retained breastplates, finding that mobility and firepower were more valuable than protection that could not reliably stop bullets. Cavalry retained cuirasses longer, as mounted troops still engaged in shock action where armour provided meaningful advantages. The nature of warfare was shifting toward linear tactics and volley fire, where individual protection mattered less than unit cohesion and firepower. The era of personal armour as a dominant factor in battle appeared to be ending. Yet armour did not disappear entirely. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, various military forces retained cuirasses for specific roles. French cuirassiers wore polished steel breastplates and backplates through the Napoleonic Wars and beyond, creating a psychological impact even if the practical protection was limited. These troops were elite heavy cavalry, and their armour served as much to identify their status and intimidate opponents as to stop bullets. British cavalry experimented with and sometimes adopted cuirasses. Russian, Prussian and Austrian armies maintained armoured cavalry units. These were anachronisms in many ways, yet they persisted because cavalry still had tactical roles where shock and intimidation mattered, and because military tradition changes slowly even in the face of technological obsolescence. The true nadir of military armour came in the mid to late 19th century. Improvements in firearms, particularly rifled barrels, and more powerful propellants, made even the heaviest practical armour insufficient. The American Civil War, the Prussian Wars of Unification, and various colonial conflicts were fought almost entirely by soldiers wearing no armour except perhaps leather equipment. Protection had been largely abandoned in favour of mobility, and casualties reflected this reality. Yet even as armour seemed relegated to ceremonial use, new materials and new understanding of wound mechanisms were emerging that would lead to its resurrection in forms the medieval armourer could never have imagined. The First World War began in 1914 with armies largely unarmoured. wearing cloth uniforms that offered no protection against modern weapons. Within months, the nature of the conflict became clear. This would not be a war of manoeuvre and decisive battles, but a grinding stalemate of trenches, artillery, and machine guns. Casualties reached appalling levels, and medical officers quickly identified patterns in the wounds they treated. A significant proportion of injuries came not from bullets, but from shell fragments, shrapnel, and debris thrown up by explosions. These fragments had far less velocity than rifle bullets, but were numerous and unpredictable. They caused devastating head wounds in particular, as soldiers peered over trench parapets or moved through exposed areas. The steel helmet emerged as the first widespread return of armour to modern warfare. The French introduced the Adrian helmet in 1915, a pressed steel design with a distinctive crest and wide brim. It was not designed to stop bullets, which remained beyond the capability of any wearable helmet, but to deflect shell fragments and shrapnel. The principle was ancient, a curved, smooth surface that would cause fragments to glance away rather than penetrating. The steel was relatively thin, around 0.7 of a millimetre, but this was sufficient for its purpose. Medical statistics from the French army showed a marked decrease in fatal head wounds among units equipped with the Adrian helmet. The British soon followed with the Brodie helmet, introduced in 1916. This design featured a wide, flat brim and a shallow dome resembling a modern hard hat. The brim was particularly important. It extended outward to shield the shoulders and upper body from fragments falling from above, a common occurrence in trench warfare where artillery shells burst overhead. The Brodie was stamped from a single sheet of manganese steel, a material chosen for its combination of hardness and resistance to cracking. Manganese steel contains roughly 12 to 14% manganese, which creates a microstructure that can absorb significant impact energy without shattering. When struck by a fragment, the surface work hardens, becoming more resistant to further penetration. The German Stahlhelm, introduced in 1916, represented perhaps the most carefully engineered helmet of the war. Its distinctive coal scuttle shape was not arbitrary, but based on systematic study of wound patterns. The helmet extended down to cover the neck, protecting against fragments from behind. The flared sides protected the ears while allowing hearing. The visor extended forward to shade the face and deflect frontal impacts. The steel was slightly thicker than that used in Allied helmets, and the shape incorporated multiple curves that provided structural rigidity while presenting deflecting surfaces at all angles. Studies after the war suggested the Stahlhelm reduced fatal head wounds by 70 to 80% compared to earlier cloth caps. Body armour also reappeared during the First World War, though in limited and specialised forms. Various nations experimented with steel breastplates for troops in particularly exposed positions, such as sentries, machine gunners, and raiding parties. These plates were heavy, typically weighing between 4 and 10 kilograms, and covered only the chest and upper abdomen. Some designs used a single curved plate, while others employed overlapping plates in an attempt to provide flexibility. The steel had to be quite thick, 3 to 6 millimeters, to have any chance of stopping rifle bullets or large shell fragments at close range. Even then, the protection was inconsistent. A direct hit from a rifle at close range would often penetrate, and the blunt trauma from even a stopped bullet could crack ribs or cause internal injuries. The weight and restriction of movement made these body armour plates impractical for general issue. They were uncomfortable, exhausting to wear during long periods of duty, and interfered with the movements necessary for combat. Soldiers often discarded them unless regulations strictly enforced their use. Some nations issued lighter armour made of layers of silk or cotton. based on the principle that tightly woven fabric could sometimes stop lower velocity fragments. These soft armors were more comfortable, but offered minimal protection against anything more serious than small shell splinters. The technology of materials was not yet sufficient to create practical body armor that could stop rifle bullets while remaining light enough for sustained wear. Aircraft crews faced unique threats and saw some of the war's most innovative armor applications. Pilots and observers in slow, vulnerable aircraft were exposed to ground fire and attacks from enemy aircraft. Some air forces issued armored seats or backplates made of thin steel or multiple layers of fabric. These provided protection against attacks from below or behind, where hits were most likely, while accepting vulnerability from other directions. The weight constraints of early aircraft were severe, so armour had to be minimal and placed only where it offered the best probability of preventing fatal wounds. Between the wars, development of personal armour continued slowly. The lessons of the First World War suggested that protection against shell fragments was practical and valuable, but stopping rifle bullets remained problematic with existing materials. Various inventors and military researchers experimented with new configurations and materials. Layered steel plates, aluminum alloys, and even composite materials using fabric and metal in combination were tested. Some designs showed promise in laboratory conditions, but proved too heavy, too expensive, or too fragile for field use. The fundamental constraint remained the same. Steel strong enough to stop bullets was too heavy to wear in useful quantities, and no alternative material yet existed that could do better. The development of new steel alloys in the 1920s and 30s offered incremental improvements. High-hardness steels using chromium, nickel, and molybdenum as alloying elements could resist penetration better than simple carbon steel, meaning slightly thinner plates could achieve the same protection. Face-hardened steel, with a very hard surface layer over a tougher core, performed well against certain projectiles. However, harder steels were also more brittle, prone to cracking rather than deforming when struck. Finding the optimal balance between hardness and toughness was a continuing challenge. The ideal armor steel needed to be hard enough to resist penetration, tough enough to absorb impact without fracturing, and workable enough to be formed into useful shapes. These properties often work against each other in basic metallurgy. By the late 1930s, as another global conflict became inevitable, helmets had become standard equipment for all major armies, with designs refined from wartime experience. Body armour remained rare, issued only for special purposes. The technology existed to make armour that could stop bullets, but not armour that could stop bullets while allowing soldiers to fight effectively. That breakthrough would require both new materials and new ways of thinking about what armour needed to accomplish. The Second World War saw continuation and refinement of helmet designs rather than revolutionary changes. The basic patterns established in the previous conflict proved sound, and most nations entered the war with steel helmets derived from or similar to their First World War designs. The American M1 helmet, introduced in 1941, represented an evolutionary step forward. It consisted of two parts: an outer shell of manganese steel and an inner liner of compressed fibre. This two-piece design provided several advantages. The outer shell could rotate independently of the liner, allowing glancing blows to slide across the steel without transferring rotational force to the head. The liner absorbed impact through compression of its material, cushioning the skull from both direct strikes and the flexing of the outer shell. The M1's shape, with a slight brim all around and a gentle dome, balanced protection with comfort and became one of the most recognizable helmets in history. Soviet helmets evolved through several designs during the war, settling on the SS-40, a simple pressed steel helmet with a distinctive ridge and slight overhang at the back. Its design prioritized ease of manufacture, crucial for a nation producing military equipment on an enormous scale under desperate circumstances. The steel was not exceptional in quality, but the shape provided reasonable deflection characteristics, and the helmet could be stamped out quickly in factories that had been producing consumer goods months earlier. German forces continued using the Stahlhelm pattern with minor modifications, maintaining what was arguably still the most protective helmet design of the war. Japanese helmets followed different aesthetic traditions, but employed similar materials and protective principles. Body armour saw more substantial development during the Second World War, though it remained far from universal. The Soviet Union issued steel breastplates to some assault troops, particularly those engaged in urban combat or trench clearing operations, where firefights occurred at close range. These SN-42 plates weighed approximately 3.5 kilograms and could stop pistol rounds and some slower rifle bullets, though high-velocity rifle fire at close range would penetrate. The weight was distributed by a cloth harness worn over the uniform. Soldiers had mixed feelings about these plates. They provided real protection in specific circumstances, but were exhausting during extended operations and could not be worn continuously. American and British forces experimented with various body armour designs, but issued them sparingly. The British developed a manganese steel vest for bomber crews, protecting vital organs against flak fragments and defensive fire from enemy aircraft. These vests weighed roughly 4 kilograms and were worn over flight suits. Air crews who were seated during most of their exposure to danger could tolerate this weight more easily than ground troops. The protection was primarily against fragments rather than direct bullet hits, but in the environment of aerial combat, fragments from exploding shells were the primary threat. Medical analysis showed that these vests reduced fatalities from abdominal and chest wounds, though they could do nothing for head wounds or hits to unprotected areas. The Pacific Theatre presented unique challenges for personal protection. The heat and humidity of tropical environments made even basic uniforms uncomfortable, and adding steel armour was often considered impractical. Japanese soldiers wore minimal protection, typically only cloth uniforms and sometimes padded caps. American forces in the Pacific generally wore helmets, but rarely any body armour. The nature of combat in dense jungle terrain, with short engagement ranges and high ammunition expenditure, meant that any practical armour would need to stop close-range rifle fire, which remained beyond the capability of wearable protection. Instead, tactical approaches and terrain use provided the primary means of survival. One significant development during this period was improved understanding of wound ballistics, the science of how projectiles interact with the human body. Medical officers and researchers systematically studied casualties, documenting wound locations, projectile types, and injury severity. This data revealed patterns that would influence post-war armour development. A significant percentage of casualties resulted from relatively low-velocity fragments that could be stopped by modest protection. Hits to the torso were most likely to be fatal, while extremity wounds, though common, were less often lethal. This suggested that practical armour should prioritise core protection over attempting to shield the entire body. Weight saved by leaving limbs unprotected could be invested in more effective torso coverage. Materials research during the war, though primarily focused on other applications, laid groundwork for future armour development. Advances in metallurgy produced stronger aluminum alloys, though these remained too weak for armour applications. More significantly, wartime industry developed improved synthetic fibres and plastics. Nylon, invented just before the war, became crucial for parachutes and other applications. Its properties, particularly its high tensile strength relative to weight, would later prove relevant for soft armor. Various composite materials combining different substances were explored, though few found immediate military application. The concept that layering different materials with complementary properties might achieve results impossible with single materials was gaining acceptance. The war also demonstrated the importance of ergonomics and human factors in armor design. Protection that was theoretically adequate but practically unwearable provided no benefit. Soldiers would abandon or refuse to use equipment that severely hampered their ability to fight, regardless of orders. This led to a more nuanced understanding. Effective armor must balance protection against realistic threats with the physical and psychological burden on the wearer. An uncomfortable or exhausting suit that prevents 10% of wounds but reduces combat effectiveness by 20% represents a net detriment. This calculus would become increasingly sophisticated in subsequent decades as methods for quantifying both protective value and performance impact improved. By the war's end in 1945, personal armor remained a marginal element of military equipment. Helmets were universal and clearly valuable, saving countless lives from fragment wounds. Body armor existed but was rarely issued, too heavy and restrictive for general use, while insufficiently protective to justify its burden. The fundamental problem had not changed since the First World War. Materials available at practical weights could not reliably stop rifle bullets. Yet the stage was set for breakthrough. Post-war research would benefit from wartime advances in materials science, manufacturing techniques, and systematic analysis methods. The question was no longer whether effective body armor could be made, but what new materials or approaches might finally make it practical. The answer would emerge from an unexpected direction, involving fibers that could be spun into threads stronger than steel wire of the same weight. Materials that would transform not only armor, but numerous other technologies across the modern world. The breakthrough in body armor came not from improvements in metal, but from synthetic fibers developed in chemical laboratories. In 1965, a researcher at DuPont named Stephanie Kwolek synthesized a new polymer that formed liquid crystals when dissolved. When this solution was spun into fibers, the resulting material exhibited extraordinary properties. The long polymer chains aligned in parallel, creating molecular structures of remarkable strength. This material, named Kevlar, possessed tensile strength 5 times greater than steel of equivalent weight. A fiber of Kevlar could support enormous loads before breaking, and when woven into fabric, these fibers created a material that could catch and dissipate the energy of projectiles in ways that rigid plates could not. The mechanism by which fabric armor stops bullets differs fundamentally from rigid plate. When a bullet strikes woven aramid fabric like Kevlar, it does not penetrate a single barrier, but must push through multiple layers of interlocked fibers. Each fiber that breaks absorbs a portion of the bullet's kinetic energy. The fibers immediately surrounding the impact point are pulled inward, creating a cone shape that distributes force across a larger area. More distant fibers are tensioned, stretching slightly and absorbing additional energy. The bullet's progress slows as its energy is converted into breaking fibers, deforming the fabric and generating heat. If sufficient layers are present, the bullet stops before fully penetrating, though it typically creates a significant deformation in the fabric that can still cause blunt trauma to the wearer. The number of layers required depends on the projectile's energy and characteristics. Handgun rounds with relatively low velocities and larger surface areas can be stopped by fewer layers than high-velocity rifle bullets. Pointed projectiles concentrate force on smaller areas and penetrate more readily than round-nosed bullets. This led to classification systems for body armor, defining different levels of protection against standardized threats. Early soft body armor, made from multiple layers of Kevlar fabric, could reliably stop common handgun rounds while weighing only 2 to 3 kilograms. This represented a transformative improvement over steel plates. Comparable protection at a fraction of the weight, with far greater flexibility and comfort. American police forces in the 1970s became early adopters of Kevlar body armor. Law enforcement faced primarily handgun threats, making soft aramid armor ideal for their needs. The vests could be worn concealed under uniforms, providing protection without the psychological impact of visible armor. Officers could wear them throughout entire shifts without excessive fatigue. Statistics began showing clear evidence of lives saved, as bullets that would have caused fatal wounds were stopped by the vest, often with the wearer suffering only bruising. This created so strong incentive for widespread adoption, and by the 1980s, soft body armor had become standard equipment for police in many nations. Military applications developed more slowly, as soldiers faced threats from high-velocity rifles that could defeat soft aramid armor. The solution emerged through combining materials with complementary properties. Hard ceramic plates, made from materials like boron carbide or silicon carbide, possess extreme hardness that can shatter and deform rifle bullets on impact. However, ceramics are brittle. They crack when struck and provide limited protection over large areas. By placing a ceramic plate over aramid fabric backing, designers created a system where the ceramic disrupts and slows the bullet, while the aramid catches fragments and absorbs remaining energy. The ceramic might be destroyed in the process, but it prevents penetration. This combination of hard strike face and flexible backing became the standard approach for military body armor against rifle threats. The Personnel Armor System for Ground Troops, or PSGT, introduced by the American military in the 1980s, represented the first widespread issue of modern body armor to regular forces. The vest used multiple layers of Kevlar to protect against fragments and handgun rounds. Additional ceramic plates could be inserted into pockets on the vest for enhanced protection during high-threat situations. The accompanying helmet, also made from Kevlar composite rather than steel, offered similar fragment protection at reduced weight. The entire system reflected evolved understanding of practical protection. Focus on the torso and head, designed for threats actually encountered, accept some vulnerability in exchange for maintainable weight and mobility. Other nations developed parallel systems using similar materials. Aramid fibers from different manufacturers, such as Twaron, offered comparable properties to Kevlar. Some designs used ultra-high molecular weight polyethylene fibers, which provided excellent strength-to-weight ratios, though with different handling characteristics than aramids. The principle remained consistent: multiple layers of strong synthetic fibers, woven or laminated together, creating flexible protection against fragments and moderate velocity projectiles. For higher threats, ceramic or metal plates provided additional protection at specific locations. The weight of effective body armor remained significant despite advances in materials. A complete system capable of stopping rifle rounds, including ceramic plates, typically weighed between 8 and 12 kilograms. This weight, carried on the torso, affects balance, increases fatigue, and restricts some movements. Heat buildup becomes problematic, as the vest prevents normal cooling through evaporation of perspiration. Soldiers wearing body armor in hot climates face increased risk of heat exhaustion. These factors mean that even the best armor represents compromises, accepting some restriction and burden in exchange for protection against specific threats deemed most dangerous. The development of improved ceramics continued through the 1990s and 2000s. Boron carbide, one of the hardest materials known, could defeat armor-piercing rifle bullets that penetrated earlier ceramic types. However, boron carbide was expensive and difficult to manufacture in large plates. Silicon carbide offered a better balance of performance and cost. Alumina ceramics, though less effective than boron carbide, were cheaper still and adequate against many threats. The choice of ceramic type became a cost-benefit decision. How much protection against which specific threats justified what expenditure and weight penalty. Backing materials also evolved. Early ceramic armour used aramid fabric behind the ceramic plate, but engineers discovered that ultra-high molecular weight polyethylene offered advantages in specific applications. This material, in its advanced forms, possesses tensile strength comparable to aramids while being less dense, allowing thicker layers at the same weight. Some designs laminated multiple materials in carefully ordered layers, each chosen for its response to different aspects of bullet impact. The construction of modern body armour became increasingly sophisticated, incorporating multiple materials and structures in systems engineered to defeat specific threat profiles. By the early 21st century, body armour had evolved from rare specialised equipment to standard issue for military forces in combat zones. The conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan saw widespread use of body armour by American and Allied forces, with constant refinement based on threats encountered. The protection saved thousands of lives, preventing wounds that would have been fatal with earlier or no armour. Yet casualties still occurred, from hits to unprotected areas, from weapons that defeated the armour, or from blunt trauma effects even when armour stopped penetration. The ancient challenge remained. Perfect protection cannot be achieved at bearable weight, so armour must be optimised for the most probable threats while accepting residual vulnerability. The 21st century brought new approaches to the persistent challenge of balancing protection and burden. Research focused not merely on stronger materials, but on smarter systems that could adapt or respond to threats. One concept that gained attention was shear thickening fluid, a non-Newtonian liquid that flows normally under gentle stress, but becomes rigid when subjected to sudden impact. When impregnated into fabric layers, these fluids could potentially provide flexible protection that stiffened only when struck by a projectile. The appeal was obvious: armour that moved naturally with the body until the moment of impact, when it would transition to a rigid state capable of distributing force. Early experiments showed promise, though challenges remained in durability, temperature sensitivity, and achieving sufficient protective effect at practical weights. Advances in ceramic materials yielded incremental improvements in hard plate performance. Engineers developed ceramics with enhanced multi-hit capability, able to withstand several impacts in close proximity rather than catastrophically failing after a single strike. This involved manipulating the microstructure of the ceramic to control how cracks propagate, containing damage to smaller regions. Composite ceramics, combining different materials in layered or mixed structures, showed potential for optimizing the trade-offs between hardness, toughness, and weight. Silicon carbide bonded to boron carbide, for instance, might provide the hardness of boron carbide where it mattered most while using less expensive silicon carbide for bulk structure. Attention also turned to protecting areas beyond the torso. Extremity armour, covering arms and legs, had been largely absent from modern systems due to weight and mobility concerns. However, casualties from extremity wounds, particularly to the groin and upper thighs where major blood vessels run close to the surface, prompted development of additional protective elements. Designs emerged for pelvic protection using shaped ballistic fabric that could deflect or catch fragments and low-velocity projectiles without significantly restricting movement. These attachments represented acceptance that comprehensive protection required addressing more than just the vital organs in the chest and abdomen. Blood loss from femoral artery wounds could be equally fatal. The modular approach to body armour became increasingly sophisticated. Rather than a single integrated system, modern armour often consists of a base vest with attachment points for various supplementary elements. A soldier might wear minimal protection during routine operations, then add ceramic plates, shoulder protection, neck guards, and groin protectors when entering higher threat environments. This modularity allowed tailoring protection to specific missions and threats, optimizing the burden protection trade-off for each situation. The system required careful design to ensure all components worked together, with weight distributed effectively and no gaps created between elements. Helmet technology advanced significantly in the early 21st century. The enhanced combat helmet introduced by American forces in 2003 used newer aramid fibers and improved molding techniques to achieve better protection than the past GT helmet while reducing weight. The shape was refined through computer modelling and empirical testing, optimizing the curves to deflect projectiles while maintaining coverage of vulnerable areas. Subsequent designs incorporated ultra-high molecular weight polyethylene, which offered advantages in stopping certain projectiles and could be molded into more complex shapes. These helmets provided protection against handgun rounds and fragments, though rifle bullets at close range remained beyond their capability. The persistent limitation was that helmet weight, concentrated on the head and neck, caused fatigue and strain more quickly than body armour distributed across the torso. Blunt trauma mitigation became an area of focused research. Even when armour stops a bullet from penetrating, the energy must go somewhere. The impact creates a temporary deformation in the armour that pushes into the body, and the sudden deceleration of the bullet generates forces transmitted through the protective system. These forces can break ribs, cause internal bleeding, or damage organs even without penetration. Engineers explored various approaches to reducing these effects, adding deformable foam layers behind ceramic plates to increase the distance over which impact energy is absorbed, using viscoelastic materials that respond differently to rapid versus slow deformation, designing complex backing structures that crumple in controlled ways. The goal was to increase what is termed standoff distance, the spacing between the outer surface where impact occurs and the body that must be protected, allowing energy absorption over a longer duration and larger area. Weight reduction remained a constant priority. Every 100 grams saved meant either reduced burden or weight budget that could be allocated to protecting additional areas. This drove research into lighter weight ceramics, thinner but stronger fibers, and more efficient structural designs. Computer modelling allowed testing thousands of configurations virtually before manufacturing physical prototypes, accelerating the optimization process. Additive manufacturing, commonly known as three-dimensional printing, offered possibilities for creating complex geometries impossible with traditional methods, potentially allowing armour components tailored to individual body shapes or incorporating internal structures that enhance performance while minimising material use. Female-specific body armour emerged as a recognised need. Traditional designs were developed around male body proportions, and while they could be sized differently, they did not account for anatomical differences in chest shape and weight distribution. Women wearing poorly fitted armour experienced discomfort, restricted breathing, and improper protection coverage. Developing armour cuts specifically for female body proportions required rethinking the shape and structure of protective elements, ensuring that ceramic plates and soft armour panels positioned correctly over vital organs while allowing proper weight distribution. This was not merely a comfort issue, but one of operational effectiveness. Poorly fitting armour is less likely to be worn correctly or consistently. The integration of electronics into armour systems represented another frontier. Body armor could potentially incorporate sensors to detect impacts, health monitoring systems to track the wearer's condition, or communication equipment. However, adding electronics introduced new challenges. The components must survive the shock and vibration of combat, function despite damage, and not create vulnerabilities where wires or batteries compromise the protective structure. Some experimental systems embedded sensors that could record impact locations and forces, providing data for improving future designs. Others explored incorporating cooling systems, using small pumps to circulate fluid through channels in the armor, mitigating heat buildup that impaired performance in warm environments. Emerging threats drove continued evolution. Armor-piercing ammunition designed specifically to defeat body armor appeared in various conflicts, using hardened steel or tungsten cores that could penetrate ceramic plates under certain conditions. This prompted development of more resistant ceramics and thicker plates, though at cost in weight. Improvised explosive devices, particularly prevalent in asymmetric conflicts, generated blast waves and high-velocity fragments that challenged existing protection paradigms. Protecting against blast overpressure, the sudden increase in air pressure from an explosion required different approaches than stopping projectiles, potentially involving materials that could absorb pressure waves or designs that prevented pressure from reaching vulnerable areas like the spine and brain. The fundamental tension in armor design had not changed in thousands of years. Protection comes at the price of burden, and the optimal balance depends on threats faced, missions undertaken, and the physical capabilities of those who must wear the protection. What had changed was the sophistication of materials, the precision of engineering, and the depth of understanding about how protection actually works at the level of molecular structures, crack propagation, and energy transfer. The armor of the early 21st century represented the cumulative knowledge of human civilization about shielding the vulnerable body, applied through the most advanced materials and manufacturing techniques available. Looking toward the future of personal armor reveals both promising technologies and enduring constraints. Research laboratories around the world explore materials that exist only in small quantities or theoretical models, seeking breakthroughs that might finally eliminate the burden protection compromise. Graphene, a single atom-thick sheet of carbon arranged in a hexagonal lattice, possesses extraordinary strength and stiffness. In theory, multiple layers of graphene could provide protection while weighing far less than current materials. In practice, producing graphene in large sheets without defects remains extraordinarily difficult and expensive. The gap between laboratory samples and manufacturing scale production represents years or decades of development. Similar challenges face carbon nanotubes, another carbon structure with remarkable theoretical properties but daunting manufacturing obstacles. Metamaterials represent a different approach entirely, engineering structures at scales smaller than the wavelengths of the phenomena they interact with. These artificial materials can exhibit properties not found in nature, potentially including the ability to redirect or dissipate energy in precisely controlled ways. A metamaterial designed for ballistic protection might channel impact energy around a protected area or convert it into forms less damaging to the human body. These concepts remain largely theoretical for armor applications, though metamaterials have found uses in other fields. The complexity of designing and manufacturing structures at the necessary scale, with sufficient uniformity across large areas, presents formidable challenges. Liquid armor systems continue to attract research interest. Beyond simple shear thickening fluids, scientists explore more sophisticated approaches where liquids undergo phase transitions or chemical changes when subjected to impact. Magnetohelical fluids, which change viscosity in response to magnetic fields, might allow armor that could be switched between flexible and rigid states. The challenge lies in achieving sufficient protective effect while maintaining practical considerations of weight, durability, and reliability across temperature extremes and rough handling. A material that performs excellently in controlled laboratory conditions but fails in desert heat or Arctic cold offers limited military utility. Biological inspiration drives another research direction. Natural armors, from armadillo shells to fish scales, have evolved over millions of years to provide protection while maintaining flexibility and minimizing weight. Modern researchers study these structures at microscopic and molecular levels, seeking principles that might be adapted to synthetic materials. The scales of certain fish, for instance, consist of multiple layers with different properties, arranged in patterns that make them difficult to penetrate while allowing flexibility. Replicating these hierarchical structures in manufacturable materials could yield improvements over current single material approaches. Narca, the inner layer of mollusk shells, achieves remarkable toughness through a brick and mortar arrangement of calcium carbonate plates in a protein matrix. Synthetic nacre-like materials might offer new paths to combining hardness and energy absorption. The role of artificial intelligence and machine learning in armor development is expanding. Neural networks can analyze vast amounts of data from ballistic tests, identifying patterns and relationships that human researchers might miss. This allows more efficient optimization of material composition, layer arrangements, and structural geometries. Generative design algorithms can propose configurations that human engineers would not think to try, potentially discovering novel solutions to old problems. However, these tools remain supplements to rather than replacements for human expertise. The algorithms require careful setup, validation, and interpretation by specialists who understand both the computational methods and the physical phenomena being modeled. Exoskeleton technology, though not armor itself, intersects with personal protection in significant ways. Powered exoskeletons that augment human strength could potentially allow soldiers to carry heavier armor loads without the same fatigue penalties. If a mechanical system bears some or all of the weight, the traditional trade-off between protection and mobility shifts. However, exoskeletons introduce their own complexities, power requirements, mechanical reliability, noise, maintenance needs, and the challenge of designing systems that enhance rather than hinder natural human movement. Current exoskeletons are large, expensive, and limited in capability, though incremental progress continues. The vision of soldiers in powered armor remains largely in the realm of science fiction, but the underlying technologies advance slowly toward practical application. The question of what armor should protect against continues to evolve. Modern conflicts involve diverse threats beyond conventional projectiles. Chemical and biological agents, directed energy weapons, and enhanced blast effects. Armor that stops bullets provides no defense against nerve agents or respiratory threats, necessitating integrated systems that combine ballistic protection with filtration and environmental sealing. Laser weapons, once theoretical, are approaching battlefield deployment. Protecting against directed energy requires different material properties than stopping kinetic projectiles. Reflective coatings, ablative surfaces, or materials with high thermal capacity become relevant. Multi-threat protection systems must address all of these hazards simultaneously, adding complexity and weight. Civilian applications of armor technology have expanded beyond law enforcement. Journalists covering conflict zones wear body armor adapted from military designs. Security personnel protecting high-value individuals or facilities use various levels of protection depending on assessed threats. This civilian market drives some innovation, particularly in concealable soft armor that can be worn under normal clothing without obvious appearance. The requirements differ from military applications: less focus on rifle protection, more emphasis on all-day comfort and professional appearance. These different priorities lead to different optimal designs, demonstrating that armour must always be tailored to specific contexts and needs. The ethics of armour also warrant consideration. Protection that allows one side in a conflict to operate with reduced casualties might encourage military interventions that would otherwise be deemed too costly. Armour that is effective but expensive creates inequality, where wealthy nations or individuals can afford protection unavailable to others. These are not new dilemmas. They have existed since the first bronze breastplate marked the wearer as elite. Yet they persist and evolve with each technological advancement. The questions have no simple answers, only ongoing navigation of competing values and realities. The history of armour, spanning millennia from leather and wood through bronze, iron, steel and advanced composites, reflects humanity's dual nature, the capacity for violence and the desire to survive it. Every advance in protection has been met with advances in weaponry, a cycle that has driven innovation on both sides. Current armour represents extraordinary achievement, the product of cumulative knowledge across generations, continents, and cultures. Materials engineered at the molecular level, manufactured with precision impossible a generation ago, provide protection that medieval kings could not have imagined. Yet the fundamental challenge remains unsolved and perhaps unsolvable. The human body is fragile, threats are diverse and evolving, and perfect protection at zero burden cannot exist within the constraints of physics and materials science. The future will bring incremental improvements, occasional breakthroughs, and continued optimization of trade-offs that have defined armour since humans first wrapped themselves in animal hides. Protection will become lighter, more effective against specific threats, more comfortable and more adaptable. But it will remain imperfect, a pragmatic reduction of risk rather than its elimination. The story of armour is ultimately a story of human ingenuity applied to human vulnerability, of the lengths to which people will go to preserve life in the face of violence. That story has no ending, only continuation, as long as both the vulnerability and the ingenuity persist.